All right, incredibly excited to talk to this author because I mentioned to him off air, but I'm going to bring it here on air so I can make him blush a little bit. But his father was a huge influence on our life. We just talked about his father in the last segment, former host of Meet the Press. And here is Luke Russert with his new book that's out now. Look for me there. Grieving My Father and Finding Myself. Luke, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be on with some of the pride of Rutgers.
That's right. Well, very well said. You said that. That's going to be a soundbite. Tim, clip that, our producer. I want to get into a bunch with the book and with what you're doing right now, what you've done before in news. But just at the top, I've seen you everywhere. You've obviously found a home going back to NBC to promote the book across, all the various programming and shows. You've been on so many different things, following you on Instagram. What's this whirlwind been like for you? 2008 Luke, looking at 2023 Luke right now, doing a book tour and appearing everywhere. What would he say to that, Luke?
Well, that's it's a good question. I often think about 22-year-old Luke, which is how old I was in 2008 when my father passed away. And I turned about 23 when I started out in media. And it was such a different era then. One of the things I like to say is that when my father passed away, I think part of the reason why we have so much nostalgia for him is that really felt like the end of an era. And what I mean by that, the end of the era of broadcast news in the morning, at night, cable during the day, real newspapers that had a circulation. And that's how people got their news, along with talk radio. And that was the infancy of Facebook and news through the internet. I mean, it was there, but it was not in your face to the level that it is today. And this whole idea of streaming and Instagram Reels and TikTok and all of that was unknown. And I think what's so interesting is that if you look at doing a book, let's say in 2008, or there's no podcast to the degree that we have today, right? The outlets are way less and they're much more traditional. I think what's been fascinating for me recently is I've had a really interesting mix of both. For everybody who says TV is dying, I would say the death of TV is greatly exaggerated. It still has a viewership. What that looks like in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we do not know. But I always tell people, there's about 20 million people that watch the nightly news every night on the three networks combined. There's millions in the morning. Cable TV, if you look at the audience over the course of the day, there's usually 1 million people watching at some point, et cetera. So that has been really interesting to see the reaction to that for a book. But I've also liked to do podcasts like this. And, I've done stuff from, I was interviewed by a royal correspondent. I was interviewed on a sports podcast. And so that's a neat thing because you can sort of micro target in a way, which is get your message out to niche groups that might be interested in a component of what you have to say in the book. So I think that kid in 2008 would be like, man, I wish I was this young in the more current environment because there's just so much more opportunity and there's so much more of a way to have your voice heard. And I'll go back to that for a second because one of the things that was very beneficial for me is I signed up for Twitter relatively early, so February of 2009, when it was still getting traction in the journalist community. And Twitter was one of my greatest assets. And I think there is something had come out internally at NBC that I had the least amount of airtime, but the largest Twitter following. So how those things correlated. And that's what I think is great for a lot of people coming out now is there is an opportunity for your voice to be heard, especially if you're sharp and you know what you're doing. The other thing I say to people who are promoting a book or promoting anything, it's don't be too prideful. I mean, go talk to everybody. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things. I was interviewed by a husband and wife that had a show about dogs. That was fun.
Well, I mean, I got to be honest. And Nick and I tried something 12 years ago on YouTube about a Raiders podcast. Him and I are both Raiders fans, and that failed miserably. And here we are 12 years later doing something in news commentary that's actually taken off. So I echo those sentiments as well. For people that, and by the way, you mentioning sports podcasts, that's where I kind of saw you recently on Rich Eisen's show. And I know he likes to do crossover topics like that. But for people that maybe don't know a little bit about your father, maybe don't know your trajectory as you went into news, you got out of news, you started traveling, you wrote this book, maybe they're not even familiar with your mother as well and her great work. Why don't you take our audience a little bit inside, not only the Russert family, but what this book is about, what made you want to write it?
Sure. So my father was late Tim Russert, moderator of Meet the Press. He passed away from a heart attack about 15 years ago. We're coming up on the anniversary, June 13th. So he died in 2008. And when he passed away, there was a massive national outpouring of grief, more so than I think anything my family ever expected. I mean, we thought that some people would know about it because he was a public-facing figure, but there were thousands of folks at his wake. He had a funeral service that was at the Kennedy Center that was broadcast live, and I ended up giving the eulogy. There was a private church service prior to that, and then there was a eulogy at the Kennedy Center, and I gave that. And that eulogy was very well received. But what I write about in the book is on June 12th, 2008. I'm sort of this happy go lucky kid, 3 weeks out of college, thinking about what I'm going to do with my life, probably approaching on a gap year, studying to try to go to grad school. I was just really interested in international relations. I've been doing a little bit of satellite radio work, but not necessarily knowing what I wanted to do. And 3 weeks, so 3 weeks out of college, and a few days after that, I'm giving a eulogy with Barack Obama and John McCain and Joe Biden and Ethel Kennedy and Dick Cheney in the rows and the pews. So that was a huge whirlwind. And what the book is about is essentially starting off there and being given a job after my father passed away, because there was a lot of TV executives in that audience that said, "Hey, you're a young guy. You're well spoken. Youth issues are a big part of this campaign. Your last name doesn't hurt. Let's put you out there and see what you can do." And I thought long and hard at the time about taking the job. It was a good idea. And my mom, to her credit, she's a journalist herself, Maureen Orth, special correspondent for Vanity Fair, talented writer, I would add. And she basically said to me, "Look, you got to make that decision on your own." And I said, "All right." And I thought about it. And I thought, look, there's some divine intervention here. There's the universe, whatever it is you want to call it. But I should at least take advantage of this opportunity that's been presented to me. And so I started covering youth issues for NBC News, and that dried up after the election, the inauguration. And I had a few months left in my deal, and I didn't really have much to do. And so I said, "Look, I don't want to sit here just sitting around doing nothing. Give me something to do." And they're like, "What do you want to do?" I go, "Well, you're short-staffed at Capitol Hill. Let me just go up there and do some off-air reporting." And I was a history major in college. And so I got up to Capitol Hill and I started covering these subcommittees at all hours of the day and just putting up in all this information in the internal file. And one of the producers from one of the shows called me up. He said, "Look, I learned so much from all these notes you put on our internal file. Why don't you do a little bit of reporting from the Hill? Just go back on air a little bit and see how it goes." And so I tried that out, and I said, "You know what? Let's do another year of this and see how that materializes." So I started reporting from the Capitol and ended up becoming a congressional correspondent, and did that for 8 years, but ultimately felt unfulfilled. And what the book is about is why I left NBC and why I felt unfulfilled, and then ultimately realizing that through travel, I became more comfortable in uncertainty, but I was doing two things. It's that I was looking for something, which the title looked for me there. So the looking was looking for the ability to be my own person and the permission to be my own person, independent of my father and his legacy. And I was running away from something, and that was the weight of grief, which I had never processed after he died. I threw myself into a job and a career and doing everything possible to maintain his legacy, his name, and his standards, but I never really worked on myself. And that caught up to me after a number of years. So the book is that journey. There's a wanderlust, there's self-discovery, there's grief. There's a lot of universal themes that it's been so humbling to see the response for it. Where people, I've had letters from people in their 80s that have said, "Thank you so much for writing this. It's helped me process the death of my parent from 50 or 60 years ago." That's really heartwarming stuff. So it's something that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Luke, it's a rough estimation, but considering how long your father had been the monitor of Meet the Press, I estimate about 884 Sundays that he was doing his job.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
So first and foremost, I want to just thank you and your family, because you loaned essentially your dad out to us, to the rest of us, for all those Sundays, just letting us be all part of the Russert family for that time. As you mentioned about the journey you took, what was one of the more powerful lessons that you took away from it? Because it sounds as though when you departed, it was really the beginning of discovery. So what was one of the discoveries along the way?
There's so many. One of the things that I write about is faith, and how that old adage that we hear often, that we're all trying to get to the same place, but we just take different roads, is very true. I mean, I was able to be around Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism. And so I learned a lot about faith and what different cultures believe, and took little bits and pieces of that in my own journey. which is basically trying to get to a place of peace and acceptance. And to get there, you have to sit in something that's difficult. And so I learned how to do that. And I would say for me, experiencing different faiths really led me to being able to accept grief. And understand that there's thousands of millions of year old script, if you will, on how to do that. The other thing though that I learned, and I mentioned a little bit at the top, which I think is very important, when you travel extensively, you become more comfortable in uncertainty. And if you are dropped in the middle of the world, you don't speak the language, you don't know where you're going, things are getting hairy or things are not well, but you're comfortable enough to say, hey, I just got to get from point A to point B, and I'm not going to freak out. And I'm comfortable with my own abilities and my own self. That's a very powerful thing, which I didn't have when I was at NBC. I joked in a talk I gave the other day. I was in a coup in Zimbabwe that I write about in the book, when the President Mugabe was being deposed there in 2017, and it was kind of scary. I mean, it was safe; there wasn't violence in the streets or anything like that, but it's scary because no one knows who's in charge or what's going on. And I said, if I was at NBC, I'd probably be screaming on the phone with the U.S. Embassy, be like, "Get me out of here!" But I was like, "Hey, I called a guy. He said, hey, if you can get out, it's pretty good." And then I ended up calling a guy who had driven me to the hotel, and he's like, my cousin's a cop, I can help you get out, and I think the airport's open, and just sort of trusted in my fellow man. And that was a wonderful thing to have been able to do. And I learned to do that. I learned to trust, I learned to be comfortable in uncertainty, and I learned how to process grief. So then there's 3 that I learned on the travels.
Quick break from our pod to tell you about a new pod at Fresh Roasted Coffee, Envy Pods. So if you go to freshroastedcoffee.com, my partner's shaking his head. That's a good transition. Are you kidding me?
It was good. No, I shook my head. I was like, that's brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because I saw this picture earlier. I was like, I saw what you're doing.
It is pretty good. That's right. So listen, the new Envy Pods over at freshroastedcoffee.com, the official sponsor of Can We Please Talk, environmentally safe, compostable. You can go check these out at freshroastedcoffee.com. When you open up the package, it smells delicious. I'm telling you, you can't smell it on here, but I promise you that when I opened this morning to make my cup of coffee, it was delicious. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. Use the promo code CANWEGET20 for 20% off your first order, or hit the link in our show details. Luke, one of the big things I took away from the book is this competition you talk about having with your mother, because I have a similar thing. My mom doesn't even watch this show. Mom, if you're watching, please start watching. But in all seriousness, and then I heard Ernie Johnson, the current TNT Inside the NBA host, talking about his father's legacy in the business. If you don't know, Ernie Johnson Sr. was a former Atlanta Braves announcer.
Yeah.
And so he talks a little bit about, with Dan Le Batard, about, this sense of, trying to live in his father's shadows, but be his own person. And when he was calling a Braves Dodger game, that dichotomy of Brave fans killing him, your dad would not be proud if you said that, et cetera, et cetera. So the question I pose to you, as somebody who doesn't have a famous mother, but still deals with the challenges of competition amongst her, and then the flip side, Ernie Johnson talking about the legacy of his father, his famous father, to millions of people out there, what advice would you give to somebody that in your book reads about this competition that they're potentially having with their parents, or even trying to live up to their parents' name? What advice would you give them based on the things that you've learned having that famous last name?
Well, I'll start with the part about your mom first, because I think it's so interesting. One of the things I write in the book is that I had never really understood who my mom was independent of that role of mom. I never knew who she was as a person. I think as we get older, we start to discover our parents as mortals, right? And you sort of get to their origin stories and see who they are. And it was through traveling with her one-on-one, which I had never done until my 30s. I had traveled with my father to sporting events and political conventions all the time one-on-one. I had a lot of bonding time with him. Never had that with my mom. And once I traveled with my mom, I realized, oh, here is this young woman that before she became a writer was a Peace Corps volunteer and grew up in a very disciplined house. Her father was very strict, and so he set really strict boundaries and instilled real values in her that she had. And so there was this personification of never settling, like always moving forward, always being aggressive, always being curious, never turning it off. And she was very hard on me, I felt, growing up, because she would say I was lazy or spoiled or entitled, et cetera. And your dad's too nice to you. And I never understood where that came from. I thought she was just being mean to me. But when I traveled with her and I saw how she would act in these foreign countries, just completely fearless, powering her way through these crowded markets, hailing taxi cabs in the middle of in crowded streets, using Google Translate to try and talk to anyone out there, I was like, wow, this is a badass woman. So no wonder she was hard on me growing up, because she was trying to get the best out of me. She was very competitive. And once I understood that, I calmed down a little bit. I was like, oh, okay, you know what? That's mom being mom, or Maureen being Maureen, because that's just who she is. And she's just trying to get the best of me. Quick example on that. This past Saturday, I did was on my feet for 3 hours, meet and greet, talking to everybody, Q&A, doing a reading, the whole 9 yards. And she was in the audience. It's very nice. I do the whole thing after 3 hours, and I'm a little tired, right, as one would be. And she comes up and she says, okay, I need a ride to this thing I'm going to right now. So just no appreciation for what happened. I was like, that's my mom, right? Move forward, go and do it. I think when it comes to last name and legacy and people who endure that, that happens not just in media. That happens in a lot of fields. And I remember I got a really nice note when I started out at NBC, and it was from a guy who ran a sandwich shop in Boston. He was like a third generation of running a sandwich shop, and he said, take the lessons that they gave you, but leave your own imprint on it. And I've always remembered that, which is that you're always going to be compared to who you came before you, especially when you have a famous last name. But even if it's a sandwich shop, and there's inevitably someone's going to walk through the front door of that sandwich shop and be like, you know what? Your grandfather's pastrami was a lot better than yours, right? And you just sort of have to understand that. That's part of the territory. It's part of how human beings act, and just don't let it get to you the best that you can. And most of the time, I think, especially as a young man, well, people would say negative things and it would hurt. I wasn't under any illusion that everyone was going to be nice or anything like that. I think there's just a natural tendency to compare somebody to their parents or to their siblings or whatnot. And one of the things I say is there's sort of like 3 ways to handle that. And I always point to the Manning family. There's Peyton Manning, who did everything in his power to be better than his dad, right? Like, I'm going to be the best quarterback of all time. I'm going to study more than anybody that's ever studied the game. And people say that about Peyton Manning, like he was a film room freak, like would never leave the film room. Then there's Eli, who's in that realm, but like not as hardcore as his brother. That's sort of, honoring the family. And then there's Cooper, the guy who's kind of behind the scenes, having a good time, is sort of happy to be there, right? So make what you want of it.
I think, Luke, as you were talking a moment ago about legacy, and often as a son, we immediately are associated with our father. It's true with Bronny and his dad, LeBron James, obviously, and there's so many comparisons like that. But what if you learned? You mentioned traveling with your mother. What you've learned more about her just in the time that you've both have bonded, and have you learned potentially that you're more like her than maybe people have sort of connected to when everyone sort of normally sees you as, well, that's Tim's son. But, have you learned that you're more of your mom's boy than maybe people gave credit for?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think there is a tendency to pair fathers and sons together, which makes sense, right? There's that very unique father-son relationship. There's that sense of masculinity and how it plays out. But what I learned when I traveled with my mother, that I'm more like her in the sense that my father was very risk adverse. He didn't like to take a lot of chances. He really valued security. He came from a very close knit Irish Catholic community in South Buffalo. It was very parochial. Everyone looked after each other, but there was this real sense of don't rock the boat too much, because if you do that, you're going to get in trouble or something bad's going to happen. And he would really work. He would have worked incredibly hard his entire life, but he really valued security to a level that we joke he signed a 12-year contract with NBC, which is unheard of in media, because you're giving up all your leverage, right? And he said, no, I like where I am. It's secure, I'm safe, I'm happy, and that's what I want to do. And I think I learned that even during my adolescence and perhaps in college and in the early part of my career, I thought that I valued that security a lot. But I realized through traveling, especially in hanging out with my mom, that no, I was more adventurous than I gave myself credit for. And I had always wanted to be adventurous. I just didn't want to betray dad. And that's one of the things I write about, is that when you're dealing with the ghost and you don't want to upset that ghost, it's a sort of hard thing to navigate. But I'm very grateful for my mom for allowing me the space to figure that out on my own. You're not sort of aggressively pushing me in one direction to be like her, sort of allowing me to realize it. Because as I realized it on my own, then I was much more likely to embrace it.
Luke, it's a perfect transition because your mom's a famous journalist. Obviously, we know her work at Vanity Fair. Your father was big in the journalism field. You spent 8 years covering the stuff that Nick and I talk about all the time with respect to DC politics. And interest of full disclosure, I started as a news producer once upon a time at Fox News. I am to blame for some of the ire of people out here. But anyway, we transition off of that because I would love to get not only your take on current state of journalism. You mentioned about it in the book. You brought it up here earlier on about, that your father kind of died right before this golden age, right? Where for like new technology, emerging platforms, the ability to have short form content in your face, a bunch of different places. Now we're seeing it more prevalent where anybody and everybody that has a microphone, an RSS feed, a recording studio like we have here with Zoom and stuff like that can push out content. It leads to misinformation, disinformation. We've seen it trickle into everyday politics. What do you make of the current state of journalism? And more importantly, what would Big Tim say about the current state of media, Sunday shows, et cetera?
It's hard to say because it's like in sports when you compare eras, right? So I think it's really fair to say that my father, when he played, it's like they didn't, there was no 3-point line. That's sort of what the comparison is. When you think about this new golden age we're in, where the technology is so fast paced and so massive and so widespread that it allows so many more voices to be included. And there's a lot of value in that, but there's also some concerns. And that's what you mentioned about disinformation and how quickly that can move around. I think the one thing, though, that my father would be upset about is there's a real lack of civility when it comes to media and politics in our discourse. And one of the things that does is it drives people into their camps, because if there's an absence of decorum and nobody can be trusted to be the effective gatekeeper, or no one can be trusted to be that sensible person in the room, then people say, you know what, I'm going to stick to my camp and I'm not even going to get out of that. So I think that's problematic. As far as what the future entails, it's fascinating because it's never been easier to obtain information, right? It moves so quickly now in every one of these different mediums, whether it's podcasting or social media or traditional broadcasts, et cetera. But on the other hand, it's never been harder. It's never been harder to verify that information is actually correct. And people hear that and go, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Well, yeah, because sometimes you can see, old photographs are circulated like they're new, or old videos are circulated like they're new, and people get all riled up." And I think what we're starting to see is that for all the advantages of everyone being a citizen journalist in some capacity, there is something to be said about standards, and there is something to be said about effective gatekeepers. And I think that's sort of where the future is going to go. Is, all right, we need to be much more upfront about who, in fact, is uttering the message and what their standards are, and be conscientious of that. And for all the problems in the mainstream media, there are at least editorial standards where if there's a falsehood or something bad, they should offer a correction. Someone blogging doesn't have to do that, right? And there's a big disconnect there.
Couldn't agree more on that. Before we let you go, Luke, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about your father's passion that's been passed down to you and also passed down to producer Tim, the producer of this show. That's the love of the Buffalo Bills. He wrote this question. We are both Raiders fans. Nick and I both mentioned about, I want my ashes spread at the 50-yard line there in Las Vegas. I'm sure your father.
So did your Raiders fandom transfer from Oakland to Vegas?
It did, of course.
Okay, my mom's brother was a big Raiders fan, and he was a vendor in Oakland. He lived in Oakland his entire life, and he was still cheered for them when they moved to LA, and then he's cheered for them when they came back, and he cheered for them when they went to Vegas. And right. I thought that was interesting. It's definitely a fan base that has been transient in a good way.
I've always gotten Raiders Nation, not LA Raiders Nation.
That's right. I was just about to say, I've always gotten asked that question. I said they could be on Mars tomorrow with the time difference. I'll still be a Raiders fan. But this is from producer Tim. What is one of your favorite Bills stories, or maybe games that you and your father went to? What's a good Bills story that you have for our our Bills listeners out there that are hoping
Oh, a Bills story. All
you
right.
lead them to a
So
Super Bowl.
I actually went to the Bills' third and fourth Super Bowls with my father, and I was a young kid. And there's the great story was in the third Super Bowl where Dallas was blowing them out of the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. We were getting ready to. We're just going to get out of here. This is brutal. This is really sad. And as we we're getting up to go, it was the infamous Leon Lett intercepts the ball, picks up the fumble, and is running to score a touchdown. And he's hot dogging it, dancing into the end zone. And the Bills wide receiver, Don Beebe, number 82, even though the Bills are getting blown out, runs the length of the field as fast as he can and knocks the ball out of Leon Lett's hand. So it's a touchback and it's a safety and prevents the touchdown. And that moment, and I remember my dad cheering in that moment, just personified Buffalo. It's like, yeah, we're getting beat up. We're getting rolled right now. But damn it, we're going to knock the ball out of you, hot dogging us as you scored the Super Bowl. We're not going to let that happen. And I remember that moment. And it was the only time, I think, after the first 5 minutes we cheered in that game. And it was pretty special for a young kid. The other ones, a lot of them are heartache ones. The forward lateral in Tennessee, we weren't at that game, but I was watching my dad very closely. And as soon as the Bills kicked the field goal to go up in that game, we all knew someone called. It was and they're like, "Congratulations, you beat the Tennessee Titans." My dad's like, "It's not over yet," and of course, it was not over. So that's one of the things you learn as a Bills fan too, which I read about in the book. I learned from Buddhism, which is embrace the suffering, for sure. But sports fandom is something that I think is so important for community and especially for fathers and sons. I mean, one of the things I've said in these interviews is when the Bills play for those 3.5 hours, it feels like dad's alive again. And that's so special and so great. So don't ever let anybody tell you being a sports fan is silly. Like, yeah, it's not the end of the world, right? But it's really important for community and for relationships and getting together. It's really how we connect in our lives now, more so than in England. We're so digital, but those moments where you're in a stadium with 50,000 other people, oh, it's fantastic.
Very well said. And obviously, as somebody who watches sports and has to explain it to my wife who watches the Bravo franchise, I try to explain it's the same thing. It's kind of like the same thing.
You got your villains, you got your heroes, you got the GMs. Yeah.
Exactly. It's truly like that.
Yeah.
Luke, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program today. You can go get Luke Russert's book out there wherever books are sold. Look for me there. Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. It's truly a great read. And Luke, I can't not only thank you for coming on here to do this interview, but also for sharing, like Nick said, your father with us every Sunday morning. We truly appreciate it. Continued success to you, sir. Please stay safe.
Mike, Nick, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.